we still feel the inflation every time we go to the supermarket still today. And the narrative we got is like, oh, this is because of the war against Ukraine. So that's the reason that explains everything.
That narrative completely ignores the role of profits in driving inflation.
These companies reaped enormous profits on speculation.
I must confess that all this is making me very angry.
As soon as you get speculation, the market price is already distorted.
Inflation was declared conquered, and so we can turn to other problems. It just means that next time we come not much better prepared.
A lot needs to be done, and it needs to be done now. Hello and welcome to FEPS Talks, the podcast of the Foundation for European Progressive Studies. I am Ainara Bascuñana. I am FEPS Head of Communication, and I will be your host today. Today we're going to speak about a topic that unfortunately we all know very well. Every time we go to the supermarket, every time we get the electricity bill, so I'm referring to inflation. And to do so, we are going to do it with two brilliant economists that they are here with me in the FEPS studio. Welcome. So I'm here with Kolesnichenko, is my colleague here at FEPS. She's the policy analyst in charge of the economic portfolio. And we also have a visitor, Ben Tippet. He's a lecturer in economics at King's College of London. And your research focuses on inequalities, right? The wealth and income inequalities at national and global level. So thanks for joining me here today. And you're both authors, among others, of this study that I have here in my hands, which is called The Profit Price Spiral in Food and Energy: Analysis and Toolbox to Fight Inflation. So this is something that FEPS has done in collaboration with the University of Greenwich, the Task Foundation, and the Neni Foundation in Italy. So the first question I have, I'm going to start with you, Ben. The first question is about the title itself, because you didn't start with the word inflation, you started with the word profit. And I was like, interesting. And I was wondering why. And also because if I recall correctly, I mean, we still feel the inflation every time we go to the supermarket still today, but it started back in 2021, right? That was the moment. And the narrative we got is like, oh, this is because of the war against Ukraine. So that's the reason that explains everything. But then here you put the word profit. So can you please explain this a little bit?
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I think you're right. You know, inflation is one of those things that we see every day, right? We feel it every day. We feel it emptying our pockets every day, every time we go to buy coffee. But profits, now that's where the really interesting thing happens, because as you say, if you take our mind back to 2 years ago, we had a massive crisis, massively rising energy and food prices. And we were told that the cause of this, the primary cause of this, is the Russian invasion of Ukraine and maybe some supply bottlenecks coming out of COVID, right? So these are what as economists we call supply side shocks. Now that narrative completely ignores the role of profits in driving inflation. And it's not just FEPS. I mean, there's a huge academic literature now that is really proving the fact that profits were hugely important in driving up prices. I mean, if you take the US, there's something called the profit margin, which is basically how much profits increase over costs, how much kind of firms can charge in incomes over costs. And those profit margins in 2022 were the highest that they've been since the 1950s. And in the EU, the IMF released a report where they said nearly kind of half of the overall increase in prices was being driven by profits, right? So profits are, I mean, this term profit price spiral, I mean, what does that mean? It really means the sense that you can have an initial shock like the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which kind of increases energy prices. And then that can be propagated through the system via many different channels, but the role in which companies effectively take maybe temporary market power, they take advantage of the situation in order to put prices even higher than those increases in costs, which then means that other, let's say if it's energy, other companies in the economy then have to put their prices higher, and maybe some of them do this, this thing called price gouging, where they kind of constantly ratchet up the prices over the costs, and we see over time then the profits kind of increasing and the prices getting higher, right? And this has been kind of well established, and what we look at in the report is, how do we learn from the fact that we don't want this to happen again when the next inflationary crisis comes? Because I mean, I don't need to probably remind your listeners and your viewers the fact that if you see a lot of money going from profits in the economy, well, that will probably end up in the very wealthiest pockets in society, because profits tend to be very unequally distributed.
So, well, we were paying high prices for food and electricity, as I mentioned as two examples. There were companies making a lot of money, no? And I suppose also being behind the causes of this inflation, besides external shocks. But yeah, and why these two sectors? Because here we're speaking about food and energy. Why did you decide to focus on these two sectors?
Yeah, well, we decided exactly because these sectors are so important for consumers. So these are the drivers of the cost of living crisis. So this is the biggest share what people spend money on, and they're very sensitive to these prices. Plus, energy sector is, as Ben already explained, is at the beginning of the value chain. So whatever shocks affect the energy price, it just gets fed through the whole economy. So the whole economy gets affected by what happens to the energy price. That's why we decided to take this one. These are systemically important sectors. That's why.
Mm-hmm. And why are there reasons behind this inflation in these two sectors? When having a look into the study, I read a lot the word monopolization. Can you please explain us what this is about?
Yeah, sure, exactly. This is exactly what this study is about. So some of them are similar for energy and food, some are slightly different. So I was dealing, and myself and the other author who is not with us today, with food, so I will explain more on food. In food, as we already mentioned, it was Russian war on Ukraine, of course, the major factor, which introduces disruption in the supplies. But there was also a factor of supply chain strain because of COVID, which was just before the war. And for example, there were some bottlenecks in transportation and some other bottlenecks. Plus, 2022 was extreme weather year, so there were actually lots of heat waves in Europe, and so this was also contributed, of course, to the food price surges. But it's just part of the story, because when we look at the kind of surge of prices that there were, for example, on the markets, I'm not talking yet about supermarkets, but trading, like wholesale markets. So there were like many times increases, like in both, like for energy and for food, which cannot be justified by any of these reasons. And we look more closely in this. And for example, for food, we see that the whole value chain is problematic. For example, on this food trading, so there are companies that trade food globally, like corn, wheat, oil, sunflower oil, like basic commodities. And these companies, like 4 of them, big 4, control 70 to 90% of these markets, depending on the segment. And basically, in these years, in 2021, it already started, not even 22. 2021, they started because of some disruptions. They started to speculate on this, and so they reaped enormous profits. There are charts here that we have, this is for energy. So you see, here, many years, this is the level for many years of profits, and then 21 and 22, 21 already, and 22, it's just shoot up several times.
The bar just goes crazy.
Exactly. So the same, like here, I will not look now, but it's the same for food. So several times profits just shoot up on trading. So, and then here we explore in more detail and show that this explosion comes exactly from speculation. Actually, this is another major problem here, that food and energy are commodities, and this is something on which traders on the global financial markets, they can make bets and speculate on that. And so whenever there is some sort of disruption, they amplify this many times because they all buy or they all sell this. And that's why actually there is this huge price fluctuation, which is not justified by any other factor, but by speculation. And these companies reaped enormous profits on speculation. And so the same, for example, for fertilizers. Fertilizer companies made enormous profits on speculation, not just by increasing prices, but by speculating really on the market. On maritime transportation also is highly monopolized. There are just several companies, 3 or 4, which control most of the maritime transportation globally. And so they increased the prices during COVID, because after COVID, when the economy started recovering, so there was bottlenecks and high demand for transportation. So they just increased prices as they wanted. And so we show that it's like another reason for food price increase, because food like grains are transported by maritime transport normally. And then the next in supply chain, we have food processing companies like Nestle, Danone, these kind of companies, which we also show this is, I would say, the picture is a bit diverse. So some of them made big profits, some of them made moderate profits, but always beyond 10% return, which is quite high by any standards. And especially like Nestle, we show, for example, that they actually made their revenues mostly by increasing price and cutting sales actually in Europe. So on food retail get more attention in the media, like this is what we all see. Food retail is a mixed picture actually. So of course there are like these big retail chains, and in some countries there are high levels of concentration, and they are increasing of food retail, which allows them to do monopoly kind of profits. But it's not everywhere. So in some countries actually the trend is different. So here the message is not conclusive, but of course food retailers were also using this opportunity when all prices are growing. They of course also did price increases.
I must confess that all this is making me very angry when I hear this. So of course the immediate question that I have in my head when I was listening to you is like, how is it possible that this happened? When you were speaking about commodities and profits and speculation in something as basic as food, basic food. I mean, we're not speaking about luxury food, but basic food. And energy. But okay, I will try to pull down. Let's go step by step. Let's look quickly at energy, because the countries did react in different ways. So what were the main reactions from countries? And if you can maybe give us some example, what worked better, what didn't work?
Absolutely, yeah. So I think when it comes to energy, there were really 2 main policies that the EU or countries in the EU implemented to try and deal with this shock, right? And the first one is what's called price controls, which is when you effectively intervene in the market to try and set the price below kind of, these very high speculatively driven prices, right? So that's the first one. And the second one is subsidies or income support, which is basically where the government gives money to households or to businesses in order for them to afford the market price of energy. Right, so this made up the vast majority of the fiscal injections that the government had into the economy. And the money actually that was put in over the kind of 2 years from 2022 to 2023 into the euro economy is absolutely huge based on these policies. It's around 440 billion, which, I mean, it's just an inordinate, a huge amount of money. Roughly a kind of around 20% of the GDP of those countries. And I think given that, we need to really ask the question of, how effective were these policies? Mm-hmm. Did they deal with the issues that Anna was just raising around speculation? And so what we can, do is just some simple exercises where we could look at, okay, some countries primarily implemented price controls. So for example, countries like Portugal and Spain primarily spent all of their fiscal spending on price controls, while other countries like Germany spend most of their spending on subsidies. And what you can see actually is when you compare all countries, but let's just stick with comparing Germany to Spain and Portugal, is that Germany had much higher energy price inflation than Spain and Portugal. And that kind of makes a lot of sense, right? Because if you control the price, then directly what you're doing is controlling the inflation, right? You're stopping the price from being able to increase so much each year. While if you just give money out to households, you might be able to protect households from the shock. You might be able to particularly protect vulnerable households, but you're not going to actually do anything to combat inflation, right? That's money that goes into the economy to pay for those higher prices. And that's really important, actually, because of exactly what Anna was saying around speculation, right? Which is one of the key problems with inflation. And this is the thing I think some economists have learned. Hopefully more economists are now learning, because we haven't had inflation for the last kind of 30, 40 years in Europe, right? Like proper kind of 20, 30, 40% energy price inflation that we saw. I think the lesson that we really need to learn from this is you need to stop the initial supply side price shock from being able to be speculated on, right? Because then what you get is that price shock being propagated through the system. You get the very most powerful companies making an inordinate amount of profits, and then the shareholders of those companies ultimately benefiting, while the rest of us are made permanently poorer. So I think what a price control does, which is quite interesting, is it stops that. It can stop that initial shock from kind of being, propagated through the economy in a way that the income support measure can't. And I think this is one of the key lessons I think we need to take away.
So in concrete terms, if I understood correctly,
yes.
Income support, the subsidies, is what happened here in Belgium, that there was a moment in which I got, I suppose everyone else as well, some money from my electricity company. Suddenly there was a pop-up in my bank. I was like, oh, okay, what is this? Nice. But I suppose that's income support, right? Subsidies to, in this case, families. But price control, how do you control prices? If you can give me a concrete example of.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it would work in the sense that, let's take something like wholesale price controls, right? So this is the price by which the kind of, the businesses or the energy producers will buy it off the wholesale market. Well, the government could come in effectively and they could, say, okay, maybe we will pay the difference in the price and then effectively give the price to the energy producers, right? So so in a way, what you'll be doing is you will be kind of, I don't want to say artificially lowering the price, because I feel like the price is already artificially high due to this speculation, but effectively lowering the price and maybe, having to spend money on what the difference would be between the wholesale market price and what those people are buying. And then effectively, that costs money, and it can't go on forever, right? I mean, in a way, you can't consistently do price controls, because on the one hand, it's going to keep the price low, which means that then maybe people will demand more of the good, right? So people might therefore demand more energy. And there were obviously real gas shortages, right? So in a way, this gets me onto a point that I would maybe like to make later, but a point basically around how price controls really need to be combined with doing things like strategic reserves, right? So on the one hand, you can implement a price control, but then what you need is strategic reserves in order to effectively, okay, the price is going to be low for a bit, it's going to be artificially lowered. We can use the strategic reserves in order to make sure that we don't run out of gas, right? Because the price is lower. And then to deal with whatever the initial shock is without the price increase propagating through the system.
But you mentioned as an example of this price control measure to give money to the provider, right? So that would be the provider of electricity. But isn't there a risk that they take the money, but they still take advantage and they still charge us more? And then how do you ensure that this abuse doesn't happen? Yeah, no,
this is a great point. I think any fiscal stimulus into the economy, right? Any kind of, when the government spends money in the economy, we need to always ask the question, like, where is the money going, right? Like, ultimately, where does that money end up in the economic system? And I think you're right. Any of these, given the kind of unequal power dynamics of contemporary capitalism, when the government spends money into the system, it tends to be the case that money works its way up to the most powerful corporations and then to their shareholders, who are the most powerful people in the world, right? So I think this would happen again with the price control, as you say. Now, to combat that, what I think we should do is we should implement and have a system for kind of automatic excess profit taxes, right? So just to briefly explain what an excess profit tax is, It's slightly different to a kind of a normal corporate tax, right? Which is, let's say in the UK, we have like a 20% corporate tax rate on profits. An excess profit tax would be if profits are particularly abnormally high, right? So let's say your profit rate, the return that you're getting on your assets exceeds something like 15% or 20%, right? Like really high profits. Exactly where that threshold should be is a matter for political debate, but something like this. Then we could tax those profits at a much higher rate, right? And then what that would do, and if that was automatically embedded into the system, then we would know that when there's these kind of supply side shocks and certain businesses are going to benefit and their profit rates are going to massively increase, that money is automatically taken out of the system by the government via taxation. And so we don't have, the scarring, long-lasting effects of inequality increasing that we've seen in the latest crisis, right? And will be I think something that will define the continent over the coming decades.
So here we are speaking about the progressive fair taxation system, basically, which is all, at the end, it's all connected, it's all intertwined.
Of course,
obviously.
Yeah.
And so you mentioned a few countries as an example, but what about EU level? Because the EU also did some things. How would you judge this action?
Well, on energy, the EU did, of course, they started immediately, but it took some time to design, was electricity market design. So it was changed, there was a reform, which introduced I think it will have effect, reducing this dependency of prices that consumers pay with markets, because there were like longer term contracts introduced, some hedging strategies recommended, some other policies like strategic reserves. But in principle, the main part which was like triggering this problem in electricity and gas was not removed actually. So there is no limit on speculation now whatsoever. So there was nothing introduced because of this crisis. There was at some point, in December 2002, there was a price limit on the market price for gas at 180 euros as a cap to prevent actually this overshoot on speculative activities. But by that time, actually, this whole overshoot already happened. It happened in August, and they introduced it in December, so it was quite late. And so the price never got so high, and this instrument was never used afterwards. So I would say, yes, measures adopted, but they were all quite late, so they didn't help in this particular crisis. So this is something for the future, and as we argue, it's not enough, because the link, also there is this link between gas price and electricity price, where electricity is defined based on the gas prices. There is a direct link. This link was not cut, which was actually a demand, a recommendation by many analysts. But for some reason, the decision makers kept it. They said the alternatives are not also optimal, but this basically means that wherever there is a gas supply shock, it will translate into electricity prices. So yes, measures done, not enough, I would say. On food, actually, it's even more frustrating, because close to nothing was done at the EU level. Previous crisis in 2008, 2011, there was another food price shock before, and at that time lots of regulations were actually introduced to limit the speculation on food. MiFID directive put in some limits on pricing and on pricing, on margins, and on putting some requirements. But in principle now, for example, in this wave of inflation, nothing was improved on speculation. And I would say speculation is the major weak spot in this whole story, because this is something which is international. It's like no one single country can control this. And so this requires much more effort at the EU level, and it's always subject to lobbyism. So even those reforms that happened in the previous crisis, 2011, 2012, they were also kind of watered down substantially to what was the original idea because of the lobby. These companies who are the traders who control all these markets and make these enormous profits, they managed to make their case to leave lots of loopholes. For example, they are called not financial companies, but they are treated as producers and not subject to any financial regulation. So they can do speculation absolutely unregulated because they managed to convince the regulators that they don't belong to this field of financial markets. And there are many examples like this. So where it's very technical, but that's why probably this remains somehow outside of public attention. But this is actually one of the core reasons why this all happens. And so the only thing on food which we saw was some price monitoring in some countries, which was quite good. I mean, Austria made some price monitoring. I mean, many others, and this was in the news. Hungary was doing some price controls in supermarkets. So this helped a little bit what we've seen, but it didn't change the picture overall. So I would say that the price on food need to be addressed not just at the very last stage in supermarket, but this has to be the whole like supply chain issue. All this monopolization, which I mentioned, need to be addressed. Otherwise, you cannot just change things in supermarket.
So if I'm understanding well, because I'm getting angry again, as much as I try to keep it cool, but so too little, too late. Can we say
Yes.
that it was done too little and too late, and especially on the food sector? Because I heard from you, the electricity, there's still some attempts and so on. Some work better, but on food, very little. And the two weak spots, again, if I understood correctly, speculation and lack of regulation, right? Because it was like kind of like a wild. Okay. So trying to look into the future. So what are the lessons that we can take from all these?
Yeah, I mean, in a way, the fact that inflation is back is, it's there's a lot of important lessons that we need to take, right? I mean, okay, this current inflationary episode, inflation's back down to the rates that the central bank wants it to be at, although prices are still very high in the supermarket, right? Because inflation is the increase in prices. It's not the actual price that you pay, which is something that people don't always realize. But we know that there's the potential for more shocks to happen in the future, right? We have huge geopolitical risks, the threat of tariffs, which can cause inflationary episodes. The pandemics themselves, right? We have an increased risk of future pandemics, increased defense spending and war potentials, and also the threat of climate change hitting supply sides, which is another huge issue, right? So given that we have these potential shocks on the horizon, we have to come up with a clear toolkit where we learn the lessons from the last 2 years. And I think if I was to kind of summarize what is the key lesson we need to learn, it's exactly what Anna said, which is we need to stop effectively the ability for people to speculate on these prices, and therefore to drive these huge distortions in the market and to create these huge problems of, making everybody poorer apart from those at the very top. So how do we do that? Well, I would say the first policy, as I said before, that we need to do is price controls, right? We need to have in place an easy to implement system of price controls for systemically important prices, right? So things like energy, things like basic food products. And why is that important, right? Because whenever you mention price controls, there's always an argument of, well, price controls distort the market, right? Price controls, it's a slippery slope towards kind of totalitarian communism, right? Might be what some people might say, right? Because it's the government coming in and controlling what the market can be quite efficient at, which is all of us going to the market with supply and demand and kind of formulating some price. But I think as Anna said, as soon as you get speculation due to this initial shock, the market price is already distorted. So what you need is the government to come in at that point and to effectively bring the price back down to stop that speculation from causing the problems that it does. So I would say price controls are systemically important. Price controls are essential. As I said, that has to be combined with strategic reserves, because if you're going to keep the price of goods low while at the same time there is going to be some kind of reduction in the supply of that good because of some kind of war, because of some kind of, I don't know, serious climate disaster, then what we need strategic reserves in order to draw from, so that over time, when the supply side shock dissipates, we are able to kind of, bring the prices back to the market, stop the speculation, and effectively consume down our reserves. Now, there are countries that do this. For example, the US does this for its oil market. It has an oil strategic reserve, a petroleum strategic reserve, where it effectively does this to intervene in the market to stop extremely volatile oil prices in the US system. So, this is something that I hope policymakers are waking up to, and I think it's a really important lesson. I would say on top of that, as I said before, we need to have a system of, I would say, permanent excess profit taxes. So taxes where we can set the rate above, let's say, abnormally high profits, where they're taxed at a higher rate. And that is a system that all businesses and politicians know exists before the crisis hits, because one of the big problems is the crisis hits, there's a big political debate, there's a delay, there's lobbying, and then effectively nothing is done in time. Well, if you have in place a permanent system of excess profit taxes, where, then basically businesses know, okay, if there's some kind of shock and I have profits that really have nothing to do with my investment decisions or any of the kind of economic decisions I've made, then I know that that's going to be taxed away, and it's kind of baked in to their decisions. Yeah.
So you're implying that things can be done in advance, no, before we have another shock, and unfortunately, it's likely to happen for all the reasons that you mentioned, no? So, this is the correct reading what I'm doing now? Like, we need to get ready now in advance?
We actually have a very nice table here with all sorts of measures, like a summary, and they are prevention, preparedness, is something you do before, then reduction, when it starts, and mitigation to cope with consequences. And then there are all long lists of things you can do. Exactly. So it's what Ben mentioned is just some like main, what comes from our study, but there are many other things. For example, like monitoring at least, what happens actually with prices. Monitoring of profits. Monitoring of profits is very weak actually in European statistics and everywhere. It comes like detailed profit monitorings, which is collected by Eurostat, comes with almost 2 years delay, the data. It's annual data. ECB, European Central Bank, collects something quarterly, but it's kind of more aggregated data, and it doesn't allow, I think, so much deciphering this kind of profiteering trends. And basically there is no data. That's a problem. No, not detailed enough. Yeah. So there should be also early warning systems. Like now, if, for example, in energy something happens, then we know early enough to be able to react to things. And then, of course, reserves, many other things that can be done.
But is there something being done already? Like, give me a good news, come on. Like, is there something that is already happening?
On energy sector, in the energy sector, things are being done. As I mentioned already, that there was this reform of electricity market design, and now also there is affordable energy plan, I think, if I'm not mistaken, which is part of a clean industrial deal. And there is actually a part that says we need to deal with the speculation on gas markets. We need to investigate this. So it's nothing yet done. So we're just investigating yet, but at least there is some promise to do this. Then, of course, during the crisis itself, there were, for example, for foods, there was a better monitoring introduced of stocks, of stocks of major food items in different European countries. So better monitoring was done. But otherwise, there is no coordination of all of this. So it's like energy is done by the energy part, and there is, I don't see anyone actually leading this effort to have some sort of coherent system, in particular, for example, coordinating with the central bank, because central bank now is solely responsible for inflation. But if we see, of course, inflation come from many other parts, so in a way, this should coordinate this somehow. But the central bank, I ask actually this question to people from ECB, and as fresh as today, Isabel Schnabel is here in Brussels. I ask this question again: are you going to coordinate the response? And she said, no. So they are monitoring, they do stress testing, but they're not going to coordinate this. So this is going, if it happens, it should come probably from the European Commission. I don't know who exactly, but yeah, so far it's just some things happen somewhere, but on food I don't see anything happening, for example. So I would say this is a bit unfortunate, because now as inflation was declared conquered, so the prices are not rising. They didn't fall, but they're not rising, so we are fine. And so we can turn to other problems. And basically it just means that next time inflation happens, we come not much better prepared. And so I would say we urge, like in this study, not only us, there are some other analysts who do this, to design this inflation preparedness framework, to have some instruments which are already there. So next time, then when a shock happens, like prices shoot up, there is something which is automatic and we know what we're doing, what are the next steps. For example, there was this price cap on gas, on wholesale markets, which expired in January. Something like this needs to be permanent, so that you don't need to gather together and negotiate it for several months, because in crisis we don't have time. Plus, it's very undemocratic. In decisions which are made in crisis, they're done without any consultation with partners, with broader society. Sometimes companies have a chance to lobby their interests, but because things need to be decided very quickly, it's very undemocratic. So now is actually the good time to do inflation fighting.
So what I get, and I think we can end in this note, a lot needs to be done, and it needs to be done now. Like, not when the shock happens, but it needs to be done now. So I want to thank you both, because it's been very insightful. I learned a lot. I hope those who have been listening until now, because we have been talking for a while, they also feel the same. Because I understand this is complex and it's technical, but I appreciate the effort you have done to bring it down to earth. And for those who wish to know more about this interesting and important topic, you can read the publication, The Profit Price Spiral, and also to join us. We have an event the 3rd of September.
3rd of September,
right? Yes, that will happen, organized by FEPS, but together with other partners at the European Economic Social Committee in Brussels. And I also welcome you to subscribe to our YouTube channel. You can comment, you can like, you can do whatever you want. And see you in the next podcast. Thanks for joining us.